Hi everyone, I'm Adam Nash and this is Tom Penney. We are practice-based researchers from RMIT University in Melbourne. Our paper is called The Radical Productivity of Play. We're going to leave a lot of detail, exposition and some of the basic concepts out of the paper for the presentation. And we just want to go for a kind of a salient summary of the paper and hopefully any gaps will be identified in questions if you want. So in this paper, we're working with a combination of the Simondonian allegmatic and a certain subset of Deleuzian transcendental empiricism, from which we have stripped the vitalism. We also include some sort of more instrumentalist or I guess design-based theories of games and play, and we are proposing several ways in which the playing of games is productive. So briefly, these are the production of percepts and affects, the production of transductive individuations or transducive individuations, production of social individuals and therefore of identity, the production of anxiety, very importantly, production of culture, the production of subversion, the production of global corporate profit, and the production of memory. So we are going to be making some modest ontological claims, more specifically ontogenetic, which we consider a kind of ontology, but some people don't. So we're making ontological, ontogenetic claims. So we're just going to read bits each, and I'll hand over to Tom now, and okay. I'll do the slides if you want.
All right. So Kant's contribution to one of the first major theories of art via the concept of beauty primarily involves a free-form play of the senses, which is conceived by Kant to be a product of the mind's mental freedom and autonomy in assigning normative structures in the world, such as harmony, perfection, and function. As such, Kant's loose definition of play, as it pertains to beauty, is that it involves at once a subjective, personal and noumenal freedom, as well as appreciation of the objective world as it ought to be. The ongoing flavour permeating theories of play today echoes this freedom in structure or freedom versus structure, or at once free yet also bound type of conception. Schiller's response to Kant's account of play and beauty in his letters on the aesthetic education of man involves a play-based society where activities and identities within such a society evolve and change in a playful, free-form way. Schiller famously held that one must posit a play drive which mediates between the timeless demands of subjective identity on the one hand and the givenness and situatedness provided the sensuous drive. Schiller's definition of play thus involves mediation between subjectivity and external reality, or in his words, the sense and form drives, in a similar manner to Kant's, but Schiller extends the notion of free-form play ideologically into the concept of aesthetic education, with the aim of helping society to achieve political freedom through the interplay of many binaries like passivity and activity, infinity and matter, sense and form. In these instances, play comes to illustrate playfulness in culture rather than the concept of play as an organised practice centred on the experience of games. It is this fixation on gaming and perhaps even the development of game studies and cultures of gamers that can distract us from the universal nature of play, where games perhaps become the limiting of play to specific forms of consumption. This gives play exchange value both in terms of its consumption and as an activity and a form of knowledge. Play as a commodified consumption is a difficult proposition. We agree with Mary Flanagan that play can be thought of as entirely productive and very integrated with what is commonly called reality. Play brings some real impact to bear on reality, which, to Flanagan and Csikszentmihalyi, is not an invariant external structure and is therefore very much affected by what play produces. Csikszentmihalyi asks, how is it possible for play to be both divorced from reality and yet so rife with real-life consequences? This has implications, of course, for the magic circle. As Castronova has pointed out, A synthetic world cannot be sealed completely. People are crossing it all the time in both directions, carrying their behavioural assumptions and attitudes with them. While we may then think of a play scenario as being born of an existing reality and existing on that reality's terms, play scenarios can also render alternative realities on their own terms. Flanagan's assertion that artist's play is subversive is here relevant, as play not only reflects reality, but also produces something when it is critical of it. By focusing on the notion of production that occurs between the play world and the so-called real world, we argue on a Simondonian Deleuzian trajectory that play is entirely productive. This is not a value-imbued proposition, rather that play is, as Kostas Axelos calls it, a system of systems, and as such cannot but be productive. In the contemporary era of global capitalism, play has, perhaps inevitably, been recruited into the pervasive contemporary program of individuals producing, reproducing and consuming their subjectivity on digital platforms. We examine this notion in detail in the final section, but first we need to define the multiple methods by which play can be seen as radically productive.
Okay, so in this section we are going to examine what philosophical concepts exist to help us conceptualise production in play before moving on to more instrumentalist examples. So in their work 1991, What is Philosophy by Deleuze and Guattari, they try to understand how a work of art can persist external to its material, its creation and its experience or reception. They conclude that what persists in the world, or what we call an artwork, is a block of sensations, that is to say, a compound of percepts and affects. So they're careful to distinguish these percepts and affects as independent beings, separate from the perceptions and the affections that bear them within both the creator, the experience and the material. We can think of these percepts and affects as productions of the interaction between the creator, the material, the experiencer and the world. This is an interaction that is especially useful in understanding the processual nature of a digital game being played. We'll say in this context that the game has been created by the designers, that its material is the computer running the game, or the console or whatever, and that it is experienced by the player, played by the player, but there is no point at which we can say this is the game, and yet the game exists. And it exists independently of any of its components. So this is part of the radical productivity that we're proposing. Much as with, say, improvisational music, a player of games creates in real time and in concert with the designer and the machine percepts and affects that stand on their own, beyond the instance of their being played. These products of play are composed in real time, on the fly, anew at each play. Deleuze and Guattari show that this is not a situation unique to digital games, but a quality of all art. In fact, the production of this block of sensations is facilitated by cycles of production methodically interacting with each other whilst executing different methodologies. In this sense, we might speculate that play itself would qualify as what Deleuze and Guattari call a chaoid, since it cuts a plane through chaos in order to produce a reality, even though in that essay they only admit three such daughters of chaos, as they call them, being art, science and philosophy. But whether we subsume play under one of these chaoids or promote it as one of its own, what is important in relation to our study of productivity is that Deleuze and Guattari insist that such chaoids are realities that are produced. But exactly how does such production of realities and affects and percepts work? How is it that disparate fields like the designer, the game player and the console are knitted together to create realities? And this is the domain of Gilbert Simondon's transduction. So for Simondon, who, as you know, was a massive and often unacknowledged influence on Deleuze. There is no individual, only a perpetually ongoing process of individuation. This process of individuation always involves the interaction of disparate fields that inform each other. For Simondon, the notion of form itself is replaced by that of information. In many ways, this is the inverse of the cybernetic life as machine trope. Yeah? If anything, Simondon saw machines as a kind of life. And he recognised no distinction between the organic and the vital, seeing them as magnitudes on the same continuum. So this is important in relation to our concept of production, because it explains how an assemblage of a designer, a machine and a player can produce new entities in the world. It shows us that we cannot think in terms of individual subjects, static and separate, rather ongoing dynamic networks participating in the production of individuation within and without a metastable pre-individual, which continues to inform the disparate fields and their resolution. Because this process is perpetual and incessant, neither these fields nor their resolution is ever in a static state. Rather, they are all in a constant ongoing production process, which Simondon calls individuation. Thus, there is no individual, rather a constantly renewing production and reproduction of an individual. So this is Simondon's allegmatic, or theory of changes. The relevant element that distinguishes, maybe the relevant element that distinguishes Simondon's transduction from the philosophical notion of the dialectic is time. Maybe. But whether it's produced by or happens in time, it is the dimension that ensures a constant production of information, rather than the loss that is presumed in deduction or induction. So with transduction, nothing ever is lost to the world. In fact, we could say that loss is impossible in the context of Simondon's metastable pre-individual. This is the radical productivity of which we speak, because play produces excess upon excess, which allows us to assert that the productivity of play is radical, especially in relation to the understanding of productivity that inheres in the ideology of global capitalism. In such an ideology, as we know, productivity is strongly identified with efficiency. But play has no particular interest in efficiency, although games may and often do. So now just quickly we'll examine some just instrumentalist examples of play as production, where we see these philosophical concepts that we've just laid out kind of played out, excuse the pun, in the ostensibly real world of contemporary digital games and their playing. So the game designer and game design instruction manual author, Jesse Schell, maintains that the playing of contemporary games produces self-esteem in the game player as a global capitalist subject. If we accept this as true, which it seems that our assertion of the productivity of play requires us to do, then we must seriously consider the implications, especially as they relate to the notion of simulation. The production of self-esteem is very clearly related to Huizinga and others' claims for the socialising function of children's play, clearly. It is extended in the design rationale of education and brain training games and these kind of things. And it is evident in all games broadly classified under the rubric of simulation games. And I don't mean simulation in the way that Espen describes it or has been talked about today. I mean simulation games like, say, Rome Total War or The Sims or something like that, through to emergency response training games and military simulators. So adhering to this logic that Schell expounds, it makes it difficult to, adhering to the logic that we've laid out and then encountering this idea from Schell that the kind of production of self-esteem within the capitalist subject is happening in the playing of games, it makes it difficult to refute moralising claims of the influence of violence and actively sexist games on players. So I think that we need a more serious and careful consideration of this point. Yeah, I think that's, raises that. So, crucial to the construction and maintenance of subjective individual identity are memories. So this is another element that we wish to state that play produces. 5 minutes, yep. If play produces culture and subjects of that culture, then it stands to reason that it also produces memories. This undoubtedly has always been true, but is particularly evident in the era of digital games, many of which are explicitly designed along architectural lines to evoke a sense of location and of experience. While Deleuze and Guattari maintain that memory is too tied up in affections and perceptions in the past to properly participate in the production of independent entities, we disagree. We think that Deleuze and Guattari are mistaken in identifying memory with the past. In fact, memories are only played in the present and into the future. Memory, inextricable from the subject, is constantly produced and reproduced, and the memory of any given production is itself a new production. This is a properly Simondonian understanding of the transductive chains of productive play that constitute and constantly renew the individual subject.
Okay, so if play is indeed a productive activity, then an individual both produces play and is being produced by play. Play is a key to the psychological development of humans, not only in children, but in adult life as well, and as such, it is a tool for shaping and understanding the self. Play does not function in its own unproductive or separate reality, but at the site of change, or affect between individuals, simulated states of play and events in the world. Here we discuss how play is an activity that facilitates the production of identity through the testing of simulated identities against play scenarios. As we see in Simondon, an identity is a dynamic construct in progress, something that is different at every moment, as forces both small and large interact with it at every moment through time. If play were to be a chaoid, as we suggested above, its function would include giving consistency to the chaos of a subject that is never fixed and is perpetually changing, by symbolising possibilities for the self with play roles. These roles frame the subject who might be. We could say that games are performative in this sense, as they require the deployment of various patterns of role play over time. Take two examples, playing World of Warcraft or playing The Sims. In both of these games, players have the opportunity to create roles for themselves based on a series of options that are selected and packaged into one or more playable characters. In World of Warcraft, these roles take the appearance of classic fantasy archetypes, but a player can dress and tweak their character for personal preference. In The Sims, a player may construct a character that reflects a contemporary suburban or domestic reality, but in either case, we can render a specific role consistent over time. I always play a mage, for example, in the World of Warcraft, or I always make a character that is close to myself and my own home in The Sims. But we can also take or test different identities over time. I might have 8 different alternative tunes that I play on WoW, or I might have a whole neighbourhood of Sims that I like to play one after the other. Through the former approach, players may tend towards consuming play roles that are assimilated into fairly fixed patterns of self-representation, while in the latter, players an opportunity to become or test oneself against many different roles that are subsequently drawn into an individual. Through this activity, one is producing an identity in tandem with the game, either by consuming a pattern in relation to themselves or producing variants in order to incorporate difference into one's experience. And finally, we see that this kind of identity construction not only applies to games and art, but to a general tendency in the capitalist world that tailors digital products in an appeal to identity formation. This constantly produces but subsequently breaks down identities in order to maintain them as precarious constructions. Games inevitably exacerbate the claim made by Peretti that the increasingly rapid rate at which images are distributed and consumed in late capitalism necessitates a corresponding increase in the rate that individuals assume and shed identities. Peretti here discusses Deleuzean schizophrenia and its application to consumer culture through Lacan. We extend this framing of late capitalist culture and of the way we understand ourselves in relation to media images to those of games through the notion of the Lacanian mirror, because Lacan's concept of the mirror stage describes the process by which a schizoid first gains a sense of having a unified identity. This would be a similar unity to that proposed earlier, conceived when a subject, as a chaotic entity, encounters consistency through the consumption of role-playing patterns. While Deleuze champions the schizoid as subverting capitalism's encouragement towards the fixation of normative subjects, Deleuze's conception of capitalism is that, regardless of this, it itself operates through a schizophrenic logic. According to Peretti, capitalism needs schizophrenia, which is a rhythm defined by the capitalist media that continually renews the process of an identity formation and dissolution in order to have us consume. This works by associating media images with our ego and having us subsequently disavow them, disconnect them from the ego, in order to move on to the next object of consumption. This process of identity production in play is similar to the process of identity production in contemporary digital capitalism, because both can form disparate transductive fields with the subject by testing their relation to alternative digital selves as Lacanian mirror objects. Should I keep going? Are we over time? Probably.
Yeah, shall I just read this last
Yeah,
bit?
you do the,
Okay.
you conclude.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, so we'll just finish up by saying that we explicitly identify global digital networks, both data networks that enable the playing of digital games and social networks and what have you, and the controlling networks of corporate capital, as significant elements of this machinic aspect of the subject production process. So in this context, Kuklik's and others' concept of play bore as an exploitation of the global precarious class masquerading as an empowering tool for egalitarian creativity is really spot on. So we'll just leave that a little bit out, and maybe we can, if it comes up in a question, we'll answer it in there. So just to conclude, we've identified play, we hope, as a radically productive activity, contra Huizinga and Kaiwa. We used Simondon's concept of production and a non-vitalist revision of Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the production of percepts and affects as our primary philosophical tools to examine the more instrumentalist examples of the productivity of play, including production of self-esteem, cultural individuals, subversion, production of memory, and perhaps most importantly, the global production of anxiety. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And now let's see if we have questions or comments from the audience.
Thank you. This is something that was touched on in Potsdam the other day. I think it was in Monica's keynote about video games perhaps being a degenerate form of play. I wonder if you think that video game play is what Brian Masumi called it an instrumental contraction of this notion you have of play as a chaoid. Do you think that video games, as it were, kind of offering an easy out for the more radical productivity of play that you're talking about? Or do you not have that kind of suspicion of video games?
No, I don't. No, you might. Tom, do you?
I sort of did, and that's why I put it in.
Why you put it in there? Yeah. I don't think so. I don't necessarily think that is necessarily a thing. I mean, any game is necessarily a restriction of the limitless potential of play to produce.
I guess it doesn't need to be seen in a negative kind of way. I mean, I think that it, at least at some level, makes the practice of playing, kind of reduces it to a set of symbols or designated practices. Yeah.
And I think what we're more concerned with is that obviously contemporary digital games are a major part of global capitalism and its production of identity, and therefore it is a major contributor to the production of anxiety, which seems to be the currency of the world.
We have another question here.
Yeah, exactly, to that point. Thanks for the great talk. if a child, let's say of an Amazonian tribe, is playing, and the child constitutes its identity through play, how do you link that to global capitalism? Because you said the identity building in play is similar to the identity building in global capitalism, and you used play in a very wide sense, not only play of computer games, which are outputs of global capitalism, maybe for some indie game developers would probably disagree. But how is play itself? I didn't get that point.
I'm not sure what the question is. Could you?
You said that the construction of identity, self-identity in play is similar to the construction of self-identity in global capitalism.
Yeah.
And if I take the example of a child from an Amazonas tribe or somebody who is not in touch with capitalism, how is that identity or how is that similarity in this case? I mean, how does... I haven't failed to see that...
It's more that capitalism uses play. Play feeds into what is happening at the moment in contemporary digital capitalism, and the kind of anxiety on the level of the individual that is produced by that plays into the identity play of individuals.
But if I'm in a communist society and I play, is it impossible to play then? If I'm in a communist society and not in a capitalist system, can I play? Or
Is there such a thing? Is there a subject in the world today that is not a subject of...
I used the example of a tribe, of an Amazonian tribe or something like that. I'm trying to construct something, of course, but yeah, maybe it's everything is capitalism.
Maybe, but I don't think an Amazon child would be considered not a subject of global capitalism today, but...
Are there any other questions or comments?
Hi, your answer to that question leads me to my question. Just clarify for me. Is your assertion that play always has these various sorts of productivity outcomes? So there's no circumstance in which play would not be productive in all of these categories that you've mentioned?
Yeah, that's the claim we're making.
It seems a very broad claim.
It is a broad claim, yeah. I think, I'm not sure that it's broad so much as an ontogenetic claim.
Okay, well, perhaps, but it seems, from my perspective, broad, so broad in the sense that if play were non-productive, that non-productivity would fit into one of your categories. That is there any sort of outcome or consequence of play that would not be one of the ones that you mentioned?
Yes, look, very possibly. These are the ones that we identify. Chiefly what we want to identify is that Simondonian transductive process of individuation. And so in that sense, it's not really, and again, I guess this sounds almost indiscriminately broad, that when somebody participates in something, then it will always be productive. It's, as Tom said, it's not a value proposition. It's more a sort of, I guess, a processual kind of as I say, an ontogenetic proposition based on this Simondonian idea of transduction.
Well, it just seems based on then that, my understanding now based on what you just said is that oftentimes we see theories like Sutton Smith, for instance, criticized sort of productivity kinds of perspectives by saying it eliminates bad play or random play or chaotic play or destructive play or those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Maybe you could just address that then.
Yeah, I guess I think the important point in answering that question is that it's not a value proposition. So I guess with Sutton Smith's thing, he's talking about I guess in this system you would see the elimination of something as producing the elimination of the thing. So, yeah, I think Sutton Smith's thing is more of a value proposition. Would you agree? Maybe.
Well, I would say yours is more
Oh, okay.
proposition than his. His
Oh, okay.
His seems to include some consequences of play that you eliminate. That I intuitively you think, well, play can be chaotic. It can play might tear down an individual identity as well as build it in a sense or produce it.
Sure, yeah, but that tearing down of an identity is still a construction of whatever it is that replaces the identity that's been torn down, right? So,
there's no way to get outside of your scheme.
yeah, well, as I said, it's an ontological claim that we're making. So, yep.
Okay, we have a last question over here.
A last question. Perhaps more of a comment, though. No, I'd like to sort of piggyback a little bit on this, but not turn it into too private a conversation. It just seems to me, and I think maybe others as well, that there's sort of a kind of difference between these kind of productive outcomes in the sense that percepts and affect seems to be very general in the sense that you assume that the cognitive emotional system of people works like that in any situation. So that's not at all specific to play. So I need you to sort of specify what type of percepts and affects are specific to play.
Sure. So,
but let me finish in the sense that sort of that memory, not specific at all. Anxiety seems to me much more specific. Subversion, much more specific. Cultural individuals, not at all specific. Self-esteem, much more specific. So it seems to me that you're sort of conflating sort of some general ontological, you call it something else, claims about the nature of reality and experience and all that stuff, and we have different theories about that. And then you have some very specific outcomes that could be tied to capitalism. But isn't it kind of a problem that you say that the radical productivity of play is that we're people, in a way? Don't you need to sort of separate these two claims for it to be sort of a cogent argument that tells us something?
The two claims being that
here is something that's pretty general about human existence.
Yep,
we're
yep.
biological beings, all of that stuff. We're social beings, so on and so on.
Yep.
And then there's that particular sort of thing that is play. I mean, those two things sort of shouldn't be all rolled into one, should they?
Okay, let me just address the first part about the percepts and the affects, and then maybe we can get to that second bit. The percepts and affects that we're talking about are very specific productions that arise from that interaction of the playing. So it's not the perceptions or the affections of the people who are playing the game, or in what we're doing, as I said, is kind of using Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the production of percepts and affects in artworks and extending that to digital games specifically. There's a distinction between the perceptions of the player and also the affections of the player, physical, emotional, etc., and the percepts and affects that are created by the playing of that game, that specific game at that specific time. Say again? What is the difference? So the difference is what Deleuze and Guattari define as an artwork. Right? So let's say using some examples from today, say with Emma's thing about Stalker Pripyat, is that what it's called? Pripyat. That experience of that particular virtual environment that we have all shared if we've played the game is the percept and affect block of sensations that is created and continues in the world external to say, me if I've played it or Emma if I've played it. It's still, and this is why we need recourse to Simondon, because how can we account for the fact that it is shared between us and yet is external to us at the same time and continues to exist in the world independently of both us as players, of the machine that it was played on, and the medium on which it was, you know, kind of transmitted, and the machine that was used to play it. And yet it continues to exist in the world. This is what Deleuze and Guattari call this block of sensation, or percepts and affects, that exist independently in the world. And then we've used Simondon to understand how, because, you know, Deleuze and Guattari are not huge on how these things happen, and we believe that Simondon has a good kind of explanation of how such a thing could occur. So that's the percepts and affects.
That gives me a better handle on where I disagree with you. So
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom and Adam. We're going to take a short break before the panel Doing Philosophy with Video Games, so please be back in 10 minutes.